Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Brother Kurt. I'm not sure what level of joy that lunch fell into, but I think it was at least two of them, the short-term joy and probably some long-term joy in there as well. That was delicious. That is raising the bar on ecclesial lunches. Okay, so we're going to talk about joy strategy number 2. Before we get to that, just a couple interesting tidbits here. Some people ask the question, who's happier, men or women? And the answer is it doesn't matter. The statistics show that male and female have very equivalent levels of happiness. So it doesn't seem to be a gender thing. The thing that's perhaps a bit more interesting is age. Age surprisingly matters very little in overall happiness and well-being. And the way this was explained in one book I was reading was that young people have a lot of energy, a lot of enthusiasm, a tremendous amount of gumption, if you will, but there's also a fair amount of uncertainty, some stress as far as not really sure what their career is going to be, who they're going to marry. Obviously, as we get older, the aches and pains increase, and this can create some difficulties in our attitude. But we're also a bit more settled and a bit more, shall we say, we kind of know where we're going to be and, what our lot in life is going to be, and we've somewhat accepted it and are at peace with it. And there's less uncertainty there. So interestingly, if you look at these statistics here, age matters surprisingly little in our overall level of well-being and contentment. Perhaps some different reasons why, but overall it doesn't matter a whole lot. Just a few interesting tidbits there. Okay, so let's get into joy strategy number 2. And we'll just kind of continue on where we left off there in Philippians chapter 2. Let nothing be done through strife or vainglory, but in lowliness of mind, let each esteem each other better than themselves. So we had already talked about these words, strife and vainglory. There's a little bit behind these words, kind of ideas of self-promotion, pride, kind of groundless self-esteem, if you will. And in opposition to those concepts are the idea of loneliness, which is basically the idea of humbleness, and this idea of esteeming others better than themselves. And this is that same Greek word. You may remember in chapter 3, verse 8, Paul talked about the excellency of Christ, the fact that it was something that was held above or superior. That's kind of it's the same word. So the idea is esteeming each other at a level above or a level superior to ourselves. Now, notice it doesn't say that the person is necessarily a level above or superior to us. It just says we're supposed to esteem him that way. That should be our attitude of mind. And in verse 4 of chapter 2, it talks about, look not every man on his own things, but every man also on the things of others. And the word look there is from the Greek word skopeo, which, obviously we get our word scope from that, but it's kind of to contemplate, observe, to take heed, to mark out. And things of others is translated interests of others in Rotherham. So the idea here is we're supposed to scope out what other people are going through and almost kind of take, not in a nosy or intruding kind of way, but kind of be looking for what problems other folks might be going through. Now, I'll admit, there's things we're kind of naturally good at and things we're naturally not good at. I'm lousy at this, to really almost kind of go out of your way to say, okay, what is that brother or sister going through? What problems might they have that I can help out with? And then this is one of Nikki and I teach the junior CYC in Detroit, so we get a lot into first principles with the junior CYC kids and also rest of Scripture. So the next couple verses are really one of the main verses that Trinitarians try to use to prove the incarnation and, Christ is God incarnate. And when you read the context here, it's so helpful in helping to explain these verses. But verse 5 says, "Let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus." And the idea there behind mind is thoughts or disposition. So the idea here is, hey, you should try to have Jesus's same attitude that he had towards others. But the question then becomes, well, what attitude is being referred to? And here's the big rest of Scripture verse: "Who being in the form of God, thought it not robbery to be equal to God." And then, the next verse goes on to say, but, took upon him the form of a man. So this verse is kind of used to prove that incarnation process, which of course it isn't, but that's how it's used. So the idea of form is it's from the Greek word morphe, which is kind of the idea of external appearance. A word we would use a lot there is manifestation. How Jesus really in appearance appeared as God or was a manifestation of God. How he struck the vision, what kind of impression he made, so to speak. And thought it not robbery, the idea is an act of seizing or grasping. So, we could read this verse, while Jesus was in the God manifest, he did not think it was seizing or grasping to be equal with God, which the Greek word there has the idea of equal in quality. And it's translated agreed in other verses, kind of this idea of being equal as far as disposition or quality. So if you look at the Greek, and I'm far from a Greek expert here, but how we sometimes say the King James Version, one of the reasons we like the King James Version is it's the truest version to the Greek. And if you read it in the order of the Greek words, it's "who in the form of God being, not robbery thought it to be equal to God." Okay, and that's really how the King James translates the verse. "Who being in the form, manifestation of God, thought it not robbery, grasping, to be equal with God in equality of character." Now, most other versions do not opt for the direct translation of the Greek approach. The ESV says, "Who, though he was in the form of God, did not account equality with God a thing to be grasped." So the transition that they're making happens in the middle of the verse, where the King James basically says the whole verse is about Jesus was in the manifestation of God, and it would not be grasping for him to say he is equal to God in character. Other versions, such as the NIV, "who being in very nature God," once again, transition happens in the middle of the verse, "did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage." Obviously, nice Trinitarian rendition there. And the NLT, which that's the version we read with the boys because it's in modern English, but completely messes up the verse. "Though he was God, did not think of equality with God as something to cling to." So I personally think that we should stick with the King James on this verse and just take the very literal translation that the whole verse is talking about, Jesus was in the form of God. He did not consider equality with God something that was grasping, that it was not a reach for him to say that he was equal with God in character. I think a lot of these other versions, and some Christadelphian writings actually agree that these other versions are the better way to translate the verse. I think these versions are, to be quite honest, I think they're more, trying to make that incarnation point that, This was some kind of pre-existent God that, somehow gave up his status as God, right? I don't think that's what the verse is saying. I think the counterpoint is made here in the next verse. But made himself of no reputation, and took upon him the form of a servant, and was made in the likeness of men. Now, the cool thing about a lot of these rest of the scriptures is and I'm not trying to turn this into a first principles class, but if you read a lot of these rest of the scriptures really carefully, they're actually proving the truth and not proving the false doctrine. It says that Jesus made himself of no reputation, which the Greek word has the idea of being made void or empty. He took upon himself or embraced the form of a servant, which is the Greek word for bondslave, and was made, it just means, simply to be, just like a human being. So, Jesus was, if you read this verse for what it's worth here, it's basically saying Jesus was made a man. And as a man, he furthermore emptied himself and took upon himself the form of a servant. And if we continue on, and being found in fashion as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient unto death, even the death of the cross. So, the word fashion there is the Greek word schema. It's the idea of scheme or total package. Jesus in total package was an anthropos, a human being. He was a man. And furthermore, not only was he a man, but he was a very humble man. Jesus' character and teaching emphasized humility, and he did it both in teaching and in action. And of course, there's minor details like Jesus was obedient, God can't sin. Jesus died, God can't die. So even though this is held up as one of the toughest rest of scriptures of all, if you read the surrounding verses, it's completely proving the teaching of the truth. That there's no way Jesus could have been very God here. What happened to Jesus are things that happen to men. But the point is that he was a humble man. In verse 9, wherefore God also highly exalted him and has given him a name above every name. Once again, it's Jesus not exalting himself, it's God exalting Jesus. Once again, very anti-Trinitarian language. I think it's kind of interesting that if, even though this verse is, maybe one of our tougher rest of scriptures to deal with, if you read the surrounding verses, it actually is making a lot of points that would be very anti-Trinitarian. We know in Matthew 23, verse 12, the humble will be exalted, and whosoever shall exalt himself shall be abased, and he that shall humble himself shall be exalted. So, what is the point that's being made here? I think we've gotten, and probably rightfully so sidetracked on trying to explain why these verses are not teaching the incarnation of Christ, that I think we've somewhat missed the theme of the argument that Paul is making here in Philippians. Paul starts out, in humility, we should consider our brother better than ourselves. That's the initial point he makes in verses 3 and 4. We should consider our brother's needs too. We shouldn't just be thinking about ourselves all the time. As much as we like to do that, we should almost be going out of our way. We should be scoping out the interests of our brother. Jesus was the ultimate example of this attitude we should follow. Jesus could legitimately say, he was God manifest. If you looked at Jesus, you were looking at God. he was in the greatest of all men. And yet, he humbled himself to take on the form of a bondslave, is really the word, not just a servant. He served others before himself, and he humbled himself. So this is the most non-intuitive joy strategy, that there is a connection between service and joy. This is completely non-intuitive, totally non-intuitive, because of, our own natural minds would say, the way to make myself happy is to cater to myself, and that's what the world thinks, right? That's kind of logical in a way. But I think the Bible is teaching us here that there's a connection between serving others and making ourselves happy, which is very non-intuitive. Jesus talks about this in John 15, verses 11 through 12. That's our Hebrew word kara there. These things have I spoken, or Greek word, sorry. These things have I spoken unto you, that my joy might remain in you, and that your joy might be full. Once again, Jesus is saying that, following him should be a joyful experience. This is my commandment, that ye love one another as I have loved you. So this idea of loving your brother connected with the word joy. Now, I hope you don't mind, but we're going to look at several quotes from outside the Bible where, people that I think, probably have, some reason to know what they're talking about, have come to the conclusion that serving others is a way to make ourselves joyful. Mother Teresa, right? Obviously, we don't agree with Mother Teresa's doctrine, okay? However, she is a woman that has served all her life. And she says, nothing makes you happier than when you really reach out in mercy to someone who's badly hurt, right? And I can tell you as a 25-year-old, I didn't get this at all. It was, I remember somewhere in my 20s there thinking, you know what? Maybe life isn't always about myself. And it can be a tough lesson to learn, because I think when you're catering to yourself a lot, and that tends to happen in that age, you start to feel a bit empty. And you start to say, hey, wait a minute, maybe I'm missing the boat here. Maybe I should start thinking about other people as well. And many people that, quotes from outside the Bible that I think might be worth looking at are on this page. Chinese proverb, if you want happiness for an hour, take a nap. Love it. If you want happiness for a day, go fishing. Love that one too. If you want happiness for a year, inherit a fortune. Sounds good. If you want happiness for a lifetime, help somebody. I think there's some definite wisdom there. Sir Francis of Assisi, for it is in giving that we receive. Leo Tolstoy, the sole meaning of life is to serve humanity. Winston Churchill, we make a living by what we get. We make a life by what we give. And even Goldie Hawn, I don't know why I put that one on here, but but Goldie Hawn says giving back is as good for you as it is for those you are helping, because it gives, and giving gives you purpose. When you have a purpose-driven life, you're a happier person. So I actually think in that case, Goldie knows what she's talking about. But, these are a lot of folks that have all come to the same conclusion. Serving others leads to happiness for ourselves. Okay, Bernard Rimland, I learned in my reading, was a famous psychologist. He was the lead researcher on autism and psychology related to autism. But apparently he did this in all his classes that he taught. He would survey all the students and ask them to list out 10 people they knew best And they had to rank those people if they were happy or not, and then they independently had to rank them if they were selfish or unselfish. And uniformly, the unselfish people ranked quite high on the happiness, and the selfish people ranked quite high on the unhappiness. And once again, this is not intuitive. You know, if you're thinking about yourself all the time, you'd think, well, I probably should be happier, right? Because I'm taking care of myself. So I think really what this is boiling down to is we have a decision on who we're going to serve. Are we going to serve others, or are we going to serve ourselves? Now, obviously, we got to take care of ourselves to a certain extent, right? We have to get up in the morning, bathe, shower, go out, earn a living so we can eat. But I think the point is more, is our focus one of self-service or serving others? And, I will say, this talk is largely directed at myself. This is not a strong suit of mine. I recently took on the role of pastoral brother in Ann Arbor just so I could do a better job at this, and hopefully I can learn through that role. We live not only in an age of individualism, but I think it's fair to say we live in an age of selfishness. The idea of taking care of number one. And really, individualism and selfishness somewhat go hand in hand. He who dies with the most toys wins. Interestingly, in 2 Timothy 3, verse 2, the first thing that is noted as a sign of the last days is men will be lovers of their own selves. So this attitude of selfishness is called right out in 2 Timothy 3, verse 2. And what the psychologists tell us is self-indulgent people focus more on short-term pleasures to increase their own happiness. But does this type of short-term self-satisfaction really lead to long-term happiness? So people that are more self-focused, self-indulgent tend to focus on short-term means to make themselves happy. I'm not including Disneyland in this. We're keeping that in the neutral category right now until we can think about that some more. But does this type of short-term self-satisfaction really lead to long-term happiness? So this is where some of this reading in subjective real well-being really got interesting, I have to say. There is something, I had no idea this thing existed, but it's called the emotional rubber band effect. And the basic idea is for every high, there must be a low when it comes to short-term pleasure seeking. And we can think of perhaps some practical examples here that we've experienced in our own lives. Has anyone here ever gone on a fantastic vacation, just had a great time, spent time with family and friends? How does that Monday after feel, going back to work? You're like, this is the pits. I can't believe I deal with this on a daily basis, right? So you had that high of a great vacation followed by a low of going back to work. And it seems pretty low. Now, granted, you kind of get back to your routine and, you start to accept the fact that, yes, I do need to work for a living and, get back into your groove. But that big high is followed by a low. It can work the other way. Let's say we have a very tough workout. You're really going through some pain at the gym, maybe doing a jog or something, but you kind of get that high afterwards of, feeling really good, really, you get that endorphin rush, you get that high that came after the low. Even a woman going through labor, having, kind of experienced it off to the side for a few times, that does not look like a pleasant experience, but, when that baby comes out, mom seems pretty happy, So, there's a low and there's a high, right? So we can see that this is a bit of a law. And interestingly, the Bible has, of course, been many years before its time, has identified this emotional rubber band effect. Solomon is our key guy in the Bible who sought short-term pleasures. You know, he made a whole lifetime experiment of pleasure seeking. In Ecclesiastes 3, verse 1, I said in my heart, go to now, I will prove thee with mirth. Therefore enjoy pleasure, and behold, this is also vanity. I said of laughter, it is mad, and of mirth, what doeth it? And then in the ensuing verses, what does Solomon do? He takes on gardening projects. He takes on building projects. He gets into alcohol. He gets into, women. Solomon tries everything. He tries all these short-term pleasures. And what conclusion does he come to? Whatsoever mine eyes desired, I kept not from them. And I withheld not my heart from any joy. For my heart rejoiced in all my labor, and this was my portion of all my labor. Then I looked on all the works that my hands had wrought, and on all the labor that I had labored to do, and behold, all was vanity and vexation of spirit, and there was no profit under the sun. And I personally think that what Solomon was experiencing here was the emotional rubber band effect. He was experiencing these great highs, whatever his high of the month happened to be, and then he was also experiencing these low lows. I think it comes out even clearer here in Ecclesiastes 7, verse 14, where he says, in the days of prosperity be joyful, but in the day of adversity consider. God hath set one over against the other, to the end that man might find nothing after him. I think that verse is connecting the idea of prosperity and adversity, that they kind of go hand in hand. The one tends to follow the other. And my apologies for putting a quote from Plato up here, but I think he was a pretty smart guy. Plato identified the fact that emotions do trigger opposing emotions. How strange would appear to be this thing men call pleasure, and how curiously it is related to what is thought to be its opposite, pain. Wherever one is found, the other follows up behind. All right, so it's Plato. He's not inspired. He's a smart guy. I think he recognized that, pleasure and pain are connected. The emotional rubber band effect is real. And, the interesting thing is, you kind of have this theory of what the pleasure-pain cycle can look like. This may be kind of like vacation, low of going back to work, vacation, a low of going back to work. You're kind of like at a bit of a zero-sum game there. And I'm not at all suggesting we shouldn't go on vacation. I'm not suggesting that at all. It's a rest that we need. But it shouldn't necessarily be our ultimate way of how we're seeking joy and happiness in life. Going on a fun vacation is not ultimately how we find true lasting joy. In some cases, when it gets into things like substance abuse, the pleasure-pain cycle can look a lot more like that. And, for any of us who've had anything to do with this, it's, addiction is a very big problem these days. The highs get a little bit less high and the lows get lower through this cycle, to where it can become a very destructive cycle and ultimately result in, really bottoming out. But this is what we're dealing with in kind of the short-term, self-indulgent, pleasure-seeking, joy-seeking ways that the world is going after today. So, a little bit of post-lunch audience participation. Why does serving, all these smart people are saying the same thing, why does serving bring joy? Any ideas out there? Sorry? Yeah, make it makes us feel good about ourselves? Yes? Right, it's very much related to this idea of community, right? It's excellent, very related to this idea of community, that we're making connections. Yes?
When we were in need and somebody helped us, that brought us joy, and so we're seeing that we're bringing the same joy to somebody else that we maybe wish we had had.
Right, it can go both ways. Any other ideas? Yes? Yeah, so you guys, as usual, are super smart. You got them all. The number one, it improves our self-esteem. Helping others, and this is the psychologist speaking, make us feel good about ourselves. We've done something positive that actually improves our self-image. It also makes us less self-preoccupied. I think we've all sometimes gotten into a phase in life where we just get very self-preoccupied. We're kind of worried about this, that, and the other thing. And what the psychologist tells us is that in helping others, it kind of gets us off ourselves. We don't worry so much about our own problems because we become more focused on other people's problems. And kind of another aspect of that is it helps us to be a little bit more thankful. Helping others helps us appreciate our own blessings. Sometimes, we can kind of get a little bit down about our own circumstances. Hey, why isn't this gone right? Why isn't that gone right? When we get involved in other people's problems, we're like, you know what, maybe I don't have it so bad after all. And there's a certain level of truth to that, and I think it's connected with the second bullet point, that it kind of helps us become less self-preoccupied and more thankful for the blessings that we do have. Okay, so let's look at a couple examples of service that Paul then goes on to talk about in Philippians chapter 2. So let's read together verses 19 through 20. But I trust in the Lord Jesus to send Timotheus shortly unto you, that I also may be of good comfort when I know your state. For I have no man like-minded who will naturally care for your state. And this word like-minded means, it's isopsychos, which means to be equal in soul. So this is, almost like a disposition that Timothy had that was very similar to Paul's. And it says he would naturally care for your state. And once again, that care doesn't give us the full meaning of the word. It actually means to be anxious or to take thought. So we see that this is the same point we were making before, that Timothy kind of naturally was anxious about other people's problems. And that's something I am going to have to work on as the pastoral brother of Ann Arbor, is I'm going to have to start becoming more in tune with what's going on in other people's lives and the problems they have. And then Paul goes on to state, something that is just so true. For all seek their own. Isn't that just so true? It's just a natural human tendency that we are concerned about ourselves first, not the things which are Jesus Christ. But ye know the proof of him, that is still talking about Timothy, that as a son with the Father, he hath served me, with me in the gospel. And that service is that same word that was applied to the Lord Jesus Christ, the service of a bondslave. So Paul really looked at Timothy as a kindred spirit, and I think sometimes we've missed the boat a little bit on the Apostle Paul. I think sometimes the Apostle Paul gets the reputation of being a bit stern and, really having to hand it to the disciples at times. And he did have to correct some things that were going on in Corinth and other ecclesias. But the Apostle Paul was he was, in my view, a wonderful pastoral brother. He was very, very concerned about the other brothers and sisters. And, he said Timothy had this same concern, how he served others. But the example I really want to spend a bit of time on is this example of Epaphroditus. Now, We don't know a whole lot about Epaphroditus because this is the only spot in Scripture where Epaphroditus is talked about. Okay, so he's kind of one of those minor characters in the Scriptures. So reading verse 25, yet I supposed it necessary to send you Epaphroditus, my brother, and companion in labor, and fellow soldier, but your messenger, and he that ministered to my want. So just a little bit of background. Epaphroditus was from the Philippian ecclesia, and he was the one that brought their financial gift of generosity to Paul in Rome. We find that in chapter 4, verse 18. He was also likely the one that Paul brought the epistle of the Philippians back to Philippi when he returned from Rome. And this idea of ministered, it's a different Greek word from the bondslave, but it's the idea of being a public servant. You know, you almost could look at Epaphroditus as someone that just had a reputation of serving in the Philippian ecclesia. Okay, so Epaphroditus had come to Paul in Rome, bearing the gift. And what happened to poor Epaphroditus? For he longed after you all. That means Epaphroditus was homesick. He didn't want to be in Rome. He wanted to be back in Philippi. And was full of heaviness. You know, it was tough on Epaphroditus because that ye had heard that he had been sick. And indeed, we'll find out Epaphroditus was very sick. For he indeed was sick, nigh unto death. But God had mercy on him, and not on him only, but on me also, lest I should have sorrow upon sorrow. So Epaphroditus was not only homesick, but he was sick. He was physically ill, a very serious illness, almost unto death. And this brings out the point to me, brothers and sisters, that Epaphroditus in his service was going through some tough times. You know, here he is doing the right thing, bringing the gift to Paul, representing the Philippian ecclesia, shows up to Rome, is terribly homesick and physically sick, right? This is what service is like. And this is what I found in my own experience, and I'm sure you found it as well. When you decide to serve, it doesn't always go that great. It's tough. You know, it can be difficult, inconvenience. Sometimes we can suffer loss as we are serving others. Going on in Philippians 2, I send him therefore the more carefully, that when ye see him again, ye may rejoice. There's our word. And that I may be less sorrowful. Receive him therefore in the Lord with all gladness. That's our Greek word. This is the only time it's not translated joy, it's translated gladness here. And hold such in reputation. So what's exactly going on here? I send him therefore the more carefully, that when ye shall see him again, ye may rejoice, and that I may be less sorrowful. Wouldn't it just be obvious that they would rejoice when they would see Epaphroditus? Was there any risk that they would not receive him with joy? But the apostle goes on, receive him therefore in the Lord with all chara, gladness, and hold such in reputation. It appears that there may have been a risk that Epaphroditus was not welcomed back to Philippi with open arms. We can only hypothesize why that might have been the case. However, it is not unusual for missionary motives to be questioned. This has happened in the past. It happened in 1 Thessalonians 5, verses 12 through 13. Perhaps, some were criticizing Epaphroditus for, taking a ecclesial paid vacation to Rome. Who knows what the reason is? But it appears to be there was some risk that he would not be received back. And Paul is exhorting the Philippians to hold such in reputation. This is another risk of service. Not only can it inconvenience us, but sometimes you can get criticized for it. Sometimes in trying to help and serve, you can get negative feedback. But Epaphroditus didn't let any of this stop him. Because for the work of Christ he was nigh unto death, not regarding his life to supply your lack of service towards me. And that sounds a little bit harsh by the Apostle Paul, but basically the idea is their lack of opportunity to serve. He was in Rome, they were in Philippi, so Epaphroditus was providing service to him on their behalf. And Epaphroditus he was not to be denied, to the point where he didn't even regard his own life. Did you ever run into someone like that who's such a good servant in the truth that you're almost like, you need to slow down a little bit and take care of yourself? And, that's probably what we would have been saying to Epaphroditus. Epaphroditus, take a break, get better, you're sick. But Epaphroditus didn't even regard his own life in his service to the Apostle Paul. So, are we commanded to serve each other? Absolutely. All over the New Testament, we are commanded to serve each other. We're commanded to distribute to the necessity of the saints, to be given to hospitality. It's surprising how many times the word hospitality shows up in the New Testament. But that's a big thing we need to remember, is to bring the brothers and sisters into our home. That's kind of where we really get to know each other. And outside the hustle and bustle of a Sunday morning. That's something we need to remember to do. If a sister was applying to be a member of the Order of the Widows, these were the qualifications, well reported of for good works. If she hath brought up children, if she hath lodged strangers, if she hath washed the saints' feet, if she hath relieved the afflicted, and if she hath diligently followed every good work. That's a pretty demanding entry requirement, isn't it? To be admitted to the Order of the Widows. And let me tell you, there was a lot of widows in the first century. So that's really a commendable life of service. And then in 1 Timothy 6, and we're just bringing out a few samples here. Charge them that are rich in this world, that they be not high-minded, nor trust in uncertain riches, but in the living God, who giveth us richly all things to enjoy, that they do good, that they be rich in good works, ready to distribute, willing to communicate. So if we've been blessed financially, we should be willing to share those in service with our brothers and sisters. So just wrapping up, joy strategy number 2. Serving others is oddly a great way to feel true joy. It's somewhat counterintuitive, but it's been observed time and time again. But we can't be discouraged if the service seems tough at first. Remember, this is a delayed reaction. This isn't the jump for joy, quick fix type of joy. This isn't, I'm serving, this is awesome, I love every second of it, this is so great. No, it's going to come later that we get that feeling of joy and well-being. Selfishness is a natural human inclination, but leads to unhappiness. I think a lot of us that have been in the truth for a while have kind of noticed this throughout our lives. Perhaps our young people, this is a message that they maybe still have to learn. The world is telling us to cater to our own needs via these pleasures, but they do not really create long-term joy. The emotional rubber band effect says for the short-term stuff, best case scenario, you're going to break even. Maybe even head down a little bit. Pleasure seeking frequently leads to a slow but steady decrease in well-being, ironically enough. So we will leave it there. Thank you for such great attention for the dreaded after-lunch class. And we'll pick up with Joy Strategies 3 and 4 tomorrow.